The restaurant was closed to the public that night. The chairs had been stacked on half the tables. The kitchen was dark, except for one light over the prep station where a single cook stood waiting, just in case. The main dining room, though, that was alive. 12 men sat around a long table near the back. They wore dark suits, white shirts, gold watches that caught the dim light from the chandeliers overhead. They smoked cigars. They drank expensive wine from bottles they didn't pay for. They spoke quietly, leaning toward each other, saying things that didn't need to be loud to carry weight. These were not businessmen celebrating a deal. These were not politicians marking a victory. These were men who controlled ports, unions, neighborhoods. Men whose names appeared in FBI files but rarely in courtrooms. Men whose presence in a room changed the air. And at the head of the table sat Frank Sinatra. He was 54 years old. His hair was dark, carefully combed. His tie was perfect. His suit fit like it had been built for him, because it had. He looked smaller than people expected when they met him in person, but not weak, never weak. He had been performing for 30 years. He had been famous for most of them. But this was not a performance. This was something else. It was late after midnight, and he had just finished a show at Caesar's Palace. The audience had loved him. They always did. Standing ovation, roses thrown on stage, women crying in the front row. He had sung the classics, the songs everyone knew, the ones that made people remember being young or in love or heartbroken. But he had not sung My Way. He saved that one. The men at the table had been waiting for him. They had sent word earlier in the week through people who knew Frank. A dinner. Private. A favor. The kind of request you didn't refuse, even if you were Frank Sinatra. Especially if you were Frank Sinatra, because for all his fame, for all the records and movies and magazine covers, Frank understood the reality of certain friendships. He understood debts. He understood arrangements that existed beneath contracts and handshakes, in the quiet places where power actually lived. He had known some of these men for decades, had sung at their weddings, their daughters' weddings, their mothers' funerals, had borrowed money from them when the careers stalled, had made introductions, opened doors, played shows in clubs they owned. The relationships were complicated, layered, impossible to explain to people outside the life. But they were real. And tonight, they wanted something from him. Not money, not introductions. They wanted the song. One of the men, a heavy-set boss from New Jersey, with gray hair and thick hands, had requested it specifically. His name was Angelo. He had been in the life since he was 15. He had built an empire moving freight, controlling docks, making sure the right people got paid and the wrong people disappeared. He was 71 now, slowing down, handing things over to younger men who didn't understand the old rules. But tonight, he wanted to hear Frank sing. Frank had agreed. He always did when Angelo asked. But there was tension in the room that hadn't been there at the start of the meal. A younger man, mid-30s, sharp suit, slicked hair, sat 3 seats down from Angelo. His name was Paulie. He was Angelo's nephew, being groomed to take over. He was smart, ambitious, and impatient. He had been talking all night, louder than the others, making jokes that weren't quite funny, drinking faster than everyone else. He wanted to be respected the way his uncle was respected. But he didn't understand that respect wasn't something you took. It was something you earned over decades of restraint. Paulie had made a comment earlier. Something about Frank. Something about how singers were just entertainers, how they worked for people like them, how fame didn't mean power. It had been quiet enough that maybe Frank hadn't heard it. But maybe he had. Angelo had given Paulie a look that silenced him. But the air had shifted. The ease was gone. Now, after the plates had been cleared, after the coffee had been poured, Angelo turned to Frank and spoke. "Sing it for us, Frank." It wasn't a command. It wasn't quite a request either. It was something in between, the way things always were with men like Angelo. A favor wrapped in friendship, wrapped in something unspoken that everyone understood. Frank nodded. He stood up slowly, walked to the small upright piano in the corner of the room. The restaurant owner kept it there for atmosphere, but it was never used. Frank pulled the bench out, sat down, adjusted his cufflinks. He didn't say anything. He didn't introduce the song. He just placed his hands on the keys. The opening notes were soft, familiar. Everyone recognized them immediately. "My Way." The song he had recorded 5 years earlier, the one that had become his signature, his anthem, the thing people screamed for at every show. It was about living without apology, about facing death with no regrets, about refusing to bow. Frank's voice started low, controlled. He didn't perform it the way he did on stage. He sang it like he was alone, like he was confessing something. The men at the table stopped talking. They stopped drinking. They leaned back in their chairs and listened. The first verse was smooth, reflective. A man looking back at his life, acknowledging the end approaching, claiming ownership of every choice he had made. The men nodded along. This was the version they knew, the version they loved, the version that made them feel powerful, untouchable. But then Frank reached the second verse. "Regrets, I've had a few. But then again, too few to mention." He paused, just for a moment, a breath longer than usual. And in that pause, something in the room changed. I did what I had to do, and saw it through without exemption. His voice was steady, but there was an edge now, a sharpness. He wasn't just singing the words, he was delivering them. To the room, to the men, to Angelo, to Paulie. Then came the line. I planned each charted course, each careful step along the byway. Frank's fingers stilled on the piano. He looked up, not at the ceiling, not at the wall, at the men, at their faces. And he sang the next part slowly, deliberately, every word separated by silence. And more, much more than this. I did it my way. The room froze. Not because the line was new. Everyone knew it. It was the most famous line in the song, the thesis, the whole point. But the way Frank sang it, quiet, firm, final, it landed differently. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't celebratory. It was a statement, a boundary, a refusal. Paulie shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. He glanced at Angelo, then back at Frank. He understood what was happening even if he didn't want to admit it. This wasn't just a song. This was Frank reminding them who he was. Reminding them that he had survived this long not by bowing, not by following orders, not by becoming someone's puppet. He had survived by making his own choices, by singing what he wanted, when he wanted, for who he wanted, by staying friendly with powerful men, but never becoming their property. He had done favors, he had shown respect, but he had never surrendered. And that line, "I did it my way," was the proof. Angelo sat perfectly still. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were focused entirely on Frank. He wasn't angry. He wasn't offended. He was listening. Really listening. Because Angelo, unlike his nephew, understood what Frank was doing. He understood that strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a song. Sometimes it was a single line delivered in a closed restaurant to a room full of men who expected compliance. Frank continued. He finished the verse. moved into the bridge, his voice rising now, filling the space. He sang about fighting, about taking hits, about standing tall when the world tried to break him. And every man in that room knew he wasn't talking about a character. He was talking about himself. When he reached the final chorus, he sang it softer than before, almost a whisper. I did it my way. Not defiant, not boastful, just true. The last note hung in the air. Frank's hands rested on the keys. He didn't look up. He didn't wait for applause. He simply stood, walked back to the table, and sat down. No one spoke. Paulie stared at his glass. His face was red. He wanted to say something, wanted to challenge, to mock, to prove he wasn't affected. But he didn't. Because he knew what would happen if he did. He knew his uncle wouldn't protect him. Not from this. Not from the truth Frank had just laid out in front of everyone. Angelo finally broke the silence. He lifted his glass of wine, looked at Frank, and nodded once. Beautiful, Frank. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement. A recognition between two men who had lived long enough to understand the cost of survival. Frank nodded back. He picked up his own glass. They drank. The conversation resumed slowly. Cigars were relit. Someone told a joke. The tension eased, but it didn't disappear entirely. It couldn't. The line had been drawn. The message had been delivered. And everyone in the room would remember it. Frank left an hour later. He shook hands, embraced Angelo, nodded politely at Paulie. He walked out into the Las Vegas night, got into a car that was waiting for him, and disappeared into the city lights. The men stayed. They talked for another 2 hours. About business, about territory, about the future. But Paulie was quieter than before. He had learned something he didn't want to learn. That power had limits. That even men who controlled cities couldn't control a song. Couldn't control a man who had decided, a long time ago, that he would rather lose everything than lose himself. Angelo knew his nephew had needed to see that. Needed to understand that the life wasn't just about strength. It was about knowing when to push and when to respect, when to demand and when to step back. Frank had just taught him that lesson without ever saying it directly. Years later, after Angelo had died, after Paulie had taken over and eventually been indicted, after the empire had crumbled the way they all eventually did, someone asked Paulie about that night, about the dinner, about Frank. Paulie didn't want to talk about it. But after a few drinks, he admitted something. He made us all feel small. Not in a bad way, just honest. Like we'd been lying to ourselves about who had the power. We thought it was us. We thought he was just the entertainment. But that night, in that room, he was the only free man. Frank kept singing My Way for the rest of his life. It became inseparable from him. People requested it at every show. They cried during it. They stood and applauded. They screamed the final line along with him. But he never sang it the same way twice. Because it wasn't a performance. It was a reminder to himself, to the audience, to anyone who thought they could own him, control him, define him. He had lived a complicated life, had made compromises, taken favors, walked close to lines he probably shouldn't have crossed. He had been investigated, questioned, followed. His friendships had been used against him. His name had been dragged through papers and courtrooms. But through all of it, he had kept something that mattered more than reputation. He had kept his voice, his choice, his way. And that night, in a closed restaurant, in front of men who could have destroyed him with a word, he reminded them of that. Not with a threat, not with violence, with a song, with a single line that said everything, without explaining anything. I did it my way. The room had frozen. Because they understood. They understood that no matter how powerful they were, no matter how much control they had over docs and unions and politicians, they couldn't touch that. They couldn't take it. They couldn't buy it. Because it wasn't for sale. And Frank Sinatra walked out of that restaurant the same way he had walked in. Free. Complicated. Flawed. But his. Always his.